we look at the way that old infrastructure has been reappropriated for the public benefit, and say, well, if we think about it ahead of time, is there a way that we can combine the social program with the infrastructure and essentially create social infrastructure? The idea being that if we're designing for a 1% of the time event, what about the other 99% of the time? We're going to spend $1 billion on 1% of the time and forget about 99% of the time. I just don't think that's a good approach.
So today, the topic that we want to talk about is sand, water, and place. How is it that we can create place in a place that really is nothing but sand and water, and to create such a vibrant economy in Europe, and the one that has had a major imprint on the global markets. As the Dutch author Hans Ibbeling notes, that Holland is really an artificial landscape. It's a human construct. Without the intervention of engineering and constant maintenance, the Dutch landscape might look something like this image here. It's interesting to talk about and look back in the history of Holland as a geological and topological transformation. There are records of, for instance, early dike formations. You can see in the lower diagram, made out of simple peat embankments, which then are blended into a landscape with sand, which over time create incremental kind of development of a landscape that protects land from the water and sea. The scale of these interventions became larger with time, and as is illustrated in this image from 1800, as engineering techniques and strategies became more prevalent. But this was not without its own challenges at the time. For instance, there was a special kind of worm that began to infest some of the wood supports in some of the dike constructions, which created a crisis in the 17th and 18th century, which placed some of the very dikes that had been put in place to protect farmland and communities from water in danger again. So there was a degree of engineering required to resustain the landscape. It's interesting to look at how the Dutch landscape has evolved over the last 2,000 years, as these 6 images begin to speak to that issue. What's happened since earlier times is that the length of the shore has decreased significantly as land area has increased. And so today we have a much smaller shoreline. Even though there's been all these efforts to protect the land from the water, there have been areas of Holland that have suffered floods, as is noted in this and illustrated in this diagram or this photograph, in the Rhine Delta. In 1953, there was a catastrophic flood. These are some of the images from that particular flood that affected the islands in the Rhine Delta. Over 1,500 people died at that time. This propelled the government to take a significant action in trying to deal with the issue, and they did that by coming up with the Delta Plan, the Delta Works project, which consisted of a series of large surge barriers and dikes, which allowed for a greater degree of protection from the sea. It also resulted in some rather extraordinary engineering feats and very inventive types of sluices and other engineering projects. But even then, the Dutch were faced with other problems coming from the other side, i.e. from the river Rhine. So it's not only protecting from the North Sea, but also from the river. So in 1995, the river Rhine swelled, creating major crisis in Nijmegen and along the river delta, the Rhine River Delta. And these are some of the diagrams of the kind of rich network of dikes and protective measures that are used to protect some of those delta areas today. In fact, we think of a dike and water protection as a simple embankment, but in fact there's a whole language of typologies that is quite rich. And then taken together in combination, they contribute to create what is today the Dutch landscape, which has a very particular and unique identity. But even with all these major investments in infrastructure and constant attempts to manage water and space, there's a recognition there's limits to what can be done with these engineering strategies. And then the question is, how does one begin to live with rising sea levels? If any country faces this issue more than any other, it's probably Holland. So this is one example where housing, for instance, in the Bay of Amsterdam, along the river in Amsterdam, is really just a series of floating barges. And there are other many strategies that are being employed to find ways of living with water. So this evening, what we're going to be looking at is not only the past to see how the Dutch have dealt with water, but looking at their current strategies, but also with an eye to the future. As we in the United States and other places around the world are dealing with the very issues that Holland has been dealing with over the last 2,000 years. So with that introduction, I want to pass the baton over to Jaap, who will lay the groundwork for us. Thank you, Jaap.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I believe, yeah. I would like to show a little bit of our work in the Netherlands and also in the United States. Mainly, well, I will show a few projects, but mainly also an approach how we work. Quick introduction. The Netherlands is an urban delta, highly urbanized and dominated by the Rhine at the end of the delta in Europe. As we just got introduced, a lot of our country is vulnerable, low-lying land, both at the coast and also along the rivers. Over the years, we've developed our floodplains to an extent that they are now obstacles in the discharge of these rivers during flood events, resulting in beautiful cities along the water, but also flood safety concerns. And these concerns become higher. There are many issues facing a country like the Netherlands resulting from climate change. For today, we wanted to focus on this issue of the river discharges, which are becoming much higher. For that, there was a national program initiated called Room for the River, basically trying to look at all these problems with all these cities and rural areas along the rivers holistically. And it was a sort of a mind shift from raising levees higher and higher to a more comprehensive strategy where still looking at the dikes themselves is one of the solutions, but there are many other solutions considered, such as widening the river, making room for the river, removing obstacles, basically making space for the water. Our firm HNS has been involved with this program from the beginning, starting to look at the river systems in Holland, conceptualizing different strategies for dealing with the cities, with the rural areas, looking at how new rivers can be created through, for example, abandoned channels, all trying to look at specific landscape characteristics in search of solutions for this problem. The program resulted in 34 projects and now nears completion. It was initiated after the floods in 1995. And now the final projects are being realized. I will show two of them. But first, some more about this program. This is a big program, very big numbers involved, both in money and area. But what is important is that the program had a double goal. So one aspect is improving flood safety, but also improving environmental quality at the same time with these huge investments. Local governments worked out the measures, but it was part of a national program, a national quality team who was overseeing everything and making sure lessons learned were shared, and the quality standard was high. One project is near the city of Nijmegen, where the river has a strong bend, and here you see the village of Lent on the other side and the city of Nijmegen on the left. During spring and the end of winter, the river fills up completely from levee to the quay in the city, resulting in a dangerous situation because of this bottleneck in the system. The project is about basically putting the levee back about 350 meters, which would be about 1,000 feet, and basically creating a second channel for the river to discharge its water, also resulting in a new island in the middle of the river, and 4 new bridges. Here you see it under construction, and it has been recently completed. We were responsible for the landscape design of this, together with the architects for the bridges and objects. But first, maybe a little bit of history. Such a project takes time to develop. Multiple alternatives were considered, creating a bypass through the north or through the middle. Ultimately, it was decided that putting the dike back, in lack of better terms, was the most favorable solution. What is interesting is that the city of Nijmegen had expansion plans on the north bank around the village of Lent, and that during this process of developing these ideas, the project was adapted to accommodate and be integrated with the river project. So the urban vision that you see on the left, which is very sort of centric oriented, has shifted to a design in which the core area is really concentrated along the river. In fact, this project has redefined the relationship of Nijmegen to the River Waal, no longer being a city next to the river, but truly a river city. The project is an urban river park, also part of an ecological network, so connecting different natural environments along the river. And this is the final plan drawing, in which you can see on the diagram on the bottom left, is a layered diagram. So I will explain a little bit in detail, but the project is about shaping the land, the interaction with different water levels, and then constructed objects and elements as a layer in that plan too. Careful design has gone into designing the river sections, creating all kinds of different conditions, different habitats, and also opportunities for example, recreational space. An urban quay has been added, which you can see here on the north, and the island, a part of the existing dike, this part, has been preserved and is now part of an island. This new channel is the water that enters it is controlled by a dam over here with a control structure that controls the water levels during normal times. Behind this plan is a close look at the water levels, and the landscape looks very differently throughout the years. Most of the time you see this, similar to the pictures you saw before, but with rising water levels in the river, ultimately only an island remains. This also is reflected in the way, for example, bridges are developed. So this is a bridge during dry time, which during higher water levels partly floods, and ultimately this route is obstructed. In this way, really people are experiencing the river and its dynamics. This is an image of the control structure which controls the amount of water that flows through the secondary channel. Different inlets on different elevations. Ultimately, it starts overflowing during extreme peak discharges. In this project, really the double goal of safety and spatial quality come together, because all kinds of uses and ecological qualities have been created as part of this intervention. A beautiful quay along the river, here still under construction, now much appreciated by the residents. Next to the people, there's also room for ecology. There's an ecological maintenance program where cattle graze and keep the vegetation under control. You want to keep low vegetation in order to facilitate the discharge of water. And the design of the shorelines have been such that natural processes can come into play. For example, eroding steep banks, very valuable and have become rare, are being added with this design. Here you can see how it looks today, or actually a few months ago. And you can see already this eroding shore, and that has been accounted for in the design. This landscape is still barren because it's recently been developed, but it will naturally emerge based on the conditions that have been designed very carefully, designing elevations and embankments, these shoals and sandy areas which fall dry. And then there are several objects in it which allow people to experience the water and reflect also the river coming underneath. Just some images of the bridges to show that these are truly, let's say, engineering. In Dutch, there's a word called kunstwerken, which means engineering art, and I think these reflect that. A second project that I would like to show is near the river Kampen. It's here on the north, at the end of the IJssel River, where the IJssel River discharges into the IJsselmeer. The city of Kampen is an historic city, very beautiful, situated along the river, and in the hinterland there's this pastoral, cultural landscape with old farmhouses and old little dikes, historic. The idea here is to create a new river that basically creates a second channel to facilitate discharge. Well, that's a big idea, right? This is an 8-kilometer new river through a polder landscape. How are you going to do this? Again, we have been involved from the sort of conceptualizing of this strategy till the construction that is currently underway. Inspiration has been taken from history. Here you see the dynamic river landscape that it used to be, and which was ultimately controlled by the local farmers to basically the current coastline of today. And here you see an historic creek that was present. That creek is still reflected in the undergrowth where the peat soils meet the clay layers. And that's where this river has carefully been, let's say, designed to find its place. Thinking about, of course, this is a lot more complicated than I will talk about now. It has to do with what is the effect on the surrounding water system, how to navigate existing structures. But in a sense, it's similar to the other project where there's a new piece in this network of riverine nature, and also a chance to redefine Kampens. This is the historic city. This is the developed modern city. A chance to, for example, create a new neighborhood as part of this development. Here you see the plan drawing where, again, certain elements are constructed, such as the new levees and bridges. And for the rest, it's mainly earthwork and letting the landscape emerge based on the newly introduced dynamics of water coming in from the lake, which is being pushed mainly by wind. The old creek is reflected in the design with the broadest dimensions at the lakeside. Currently under construction. I'll try to keep going to not take too much time. What are important takeaways according to us is really the approach to these projects. One is that we try to work with the forces at play in the natural system and try to basically influence them to our advantage. Second is that it is important to have these projects are part of a sort of collaborative, iterative process where research and design in multiple cycles reinforce each other. So this is, by designing, you raise new questions. These can be researched, another cycle of design, and ultimately you end up with a project that achieves many goals. Thinking about large-scale frameworks and providing conditions for example, natural qualities to emerge, and linking past, future, and present in one plan, trying to keep the options open for the future, while at the same time solving issues now. A layered design, we talked about it, and also the drawing of time. So what can you build and what do you allow to grow? As a firm, we've been active in the United States as well, among others, New Orleans and New York. I'll briefly show some work of that. We teamed up with Palmbout, Urban Landscapes and Bos Slabbers, who are two other Dutch firms, in a joint venture called Waterland Design Inc., based on which we now hope to contribute with this approach to the issues in the United States. This collaboration started in New Orleans, where we worked on basically three challenges as part of the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan. This is a plan about the city behind the dikes, which suffers from rainwater flooding, also subsidence, and there are urban quality issues. The water is not visible, for example, in the city. It's an underutilized asset. The current water system is highly technocratic, pipes and pumps, and the ambition is to make water an integral part of the city. As you can see here, there's a lot of water around New Orleans, but there's virtually none within, except for a few major parks. How can the landscape be reflected within the city, and how can the city act as a sponge, relieving pump stations and reflecting, basically having the underground reflect the potential for this transformation into a more green infrastructure storage-based city, which also profits from open water. Basically making New Orleans a true delta city. We worked on the system design, which has some ideas about how to reorganize this discharge system with pipes and pumps, but also has, depending on the specific urban characteristics and the underground that is present, different strategies in the city for how to accommodate this water interventions. Then briefly, something about the Rebuild by Design competition. I don't know if everyone is familiar with this, but this was a competition initiated by Sean Donovan of HUD after Hurricane Sandy. Basically, multidisciplinary teams from around the world were invited to present a team, and then 10 teams were selected to define their assignment along the eastern coast. And then form local coalitions with local communities and develop fundable and implementable solutions. We were part of one of these teams. 10 were selected. Travis is also one of these teams. And we were one of the winning teams who, with a proposal for Living with the Bay. It's a comprehensive regional resiliency plan for Nassau County. Nassau County is typical for the south shore of Long Island, where you have the barrier islands, the bay, the bays, and then the developed lowlands connected to the higher uplands. This is a very dynamic landscape, but a very fixed urbanization. The problems here are interrelated. There's a lot of vulnerable communities out there, and also the natural systems are degrading. The pollution coming from the urban environment further degrades these ecological systems, further weakening the position of the communities in terms of storm vulnerability. There are no easy silver bullets here. There's a lot of low-lying land, and there's what to do. Some problems are local, like wave action. Others are interrelated such as storm surge, sea level rise. We advocated for a system approach wherein we would look at this natural system and see how we, for example, could work with the sediment systems on a long-term plan, strengthening the coast. At the same time, work with local communities on implementable projects. 4 guiding principles: work with these natural systems, make replicable interventions, design for the storm and norm, meaning multifunctional interventions, and connecting a short-term strategy to a long-term perspective. Connecting a regional approach for the whole of the south shore of Long Island. You could call it a delta plan, like Paul showed in the introduction, with a more local regional approach for Nassau County, which was the ultimate proposal. One element got funded, the Mill River project, part of the Mill River Watershed, which is what we are working on currently. It's typical for Long Island, low-lying land connected to the uplands, a degraded water system. And we're working on improving, let's say, the natural conditions in the marshes and improving the buffering capacity for storms. Working on the river, which is basically a creek, where stormwater coming from the north interacts with tidal waters from the south. And then really working with the local community, bringing them in contact with their water system, making them aware of the vulnerabilities. 4 objectives: flood management program, but with co-benefits, strengthen the ecosystem, increase the access and use, and also increase the social resiliency, especially of the most vulnerable communities. And basically the program is based on integrated water management, so how to combine safety with security for example, drought, healthy ecosystem, attractive landscape, and a supported water system. This is an aerial view of the watershed, and it's interesting. I hope you recognize the sort of approach that I lined out in our Dutch work, in the way we try to approach this work along the Mill River. There are many communities here. How to collaborate with all these? They are jointly connected by the watershed and by this river. How to connect the bay to the lake, both environmentally, so for example in terms of water quality, and safety issues that play out all in this lower part. Physically, creating a route and making it possible for people to experience these natural resources, and mentally, so engaging the local communities with this task. I will leave it for here, and maybe we can have a discussion afterwards about the change.
When I talk to engineers and architects, landscape architects and planners in the Netherlands, I'm often reminded for John F. Kennedy's explanation of how he became a war hero. He said, well, they sunk my boat. Similarly, when I ask Dutch people, or planners, technicians, how did you conceive and plan of a barrier like this, each one of its arms, the length of the Eiffel Tower? Or how did you think of the idea of a parking garage also being a cistern? I get the same response. Well, we had this flood. And it has motivated a lot of the work, as you said, but also the fact that I think something like 70% of Dutch GDP is below sea level. And so there's a lot to learn from the processes of planning in the Netherlands, in the United States. But also because of this, there's a strong belief in planning, in government, in working with government, in public-private partnerships doesn't always go over so well in the American context. But I think one aspect of Dutch planning that does resonate well in America is that it's very entrepreneurial. And we already see the way the Dutch are working in the US. So in the work that I'm doing, my past book and the one I'm working on now, I try to translate not just Dutch, but many European cities, what they're doing in planning, and how it can relate to the United States. So when I look at a city's climate action planning, there are several things that I look for. Among them are leadership, experimentation, working across siloed departments, engagement of both the public and private sector. So I want to talk about this just in the context of Rotterdam, where I've spent a lot of time recently. So this is a delta city, 4 meters below sea level. It was hard hit by the flood. I think 72,000 people were displaced from their homes. And so while the Delta Works projects that both of Paul and Jaap mentioned protected the city from major flooding, they also had to figure out how to deal with more frequent storms and stormwater management as well. And the other aspect of it is the world's 5th largest port, so really important to protect that as well. So beginning in 2001, we see several interconnected programs emerge, and the goals of both of them deal with both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So the Rotterdam Climate Initiative seeks to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% by 2020, and the adaptation plan seeks to make Rotterdam climate-proof by 2025. Part of this came about as a very significant shift of thinking that you alluded to, Jaap, as well, is that to rethink this idea of engineering to keep the water out and find ways to live with and reconnect the city and the water. So the 2001 plan is all about the technical sides of keeping the water out. We saw this transition, and another significant aspect of this planning process was bringing the public, bringing all kinds of people in to talk about how to manage stormwater. Out of this came Rotterdam Climate Proof. And by 2008, after starting in 2005, Rotterdam had this integrated strategy for using stormwater solutions to build a more attractive city, as well as to create world leadership in water technologies. And your talk was a very good example of that. So what did they do? First thing they did was what many cities are doing, is construct a rain risk map. So using this map, planners began to prioritize areas of the city to identify appropriate strategies. And it seems like a logical and simple thing to do, but yet one of the things I find that many cities will come up with a strategy, but there's no prioritization. It's just kind of random, maybe based on, when something needs to be rebuilt, that you see any kind of green stormwater integration. So this program combines research and experimentation to demonstrate the effectiveness of new technologies, there's the experimentation, and to disseminate these programs globally. So it's this connected city delta knowledge network. One aspect of the climate-proof Rotterdam is the floating construction. So some of these are demonstrations like this that they hope to develop throughout the Netherlands and elsewhere. So this is one strategy for living with water, and the Netherlands is a world leader in the floating construction. So this is the floating pavilion. From here on in, I don't use many of my photos because you can see why I'm not that great a photographer. But this is in the harbor in the center of Rotterdam. This was completed in 2010. It's about as big as 4 tennis courts. And it's used to showcase the city's strategies for climate resilience. And it generates its own renewable energy, and its water is clean there. This is where the innovation and technology comes into play. Buildings have to be light to float. Several technologies were to develop to achieve this lightness. It's built on a 2.5 meter layer of polystyrene. And the domes have light steel frames that you can see in this photo, covered with a kind of foil that is 100 times lighter than glass. These layers of foil then filled with air under pressure to become the insulation for the building. And the tops are covered with another kind of foil which provides ultraviolet protection. So this is an icon for the Netherlands Water Partnership, and it's a network of over 200 organizations and businesses that want to make the Netherlands what they call the Water Harvard. Another innovation is the museum park. The idea here is it can hold about 1,150 cars, but if needed in a major storm event, it can also hold about 4 Olympic swimming pools of water that can be gradually released after an event. So the water is stored in the garage. This is a depiction of water storage above the garage. Another innovation that Jaap talked about as well is the tidal park. And that was a concept, a solution actually developed in the Netherlands, and they're developing these in Rotterdam as well. And this is, the idea is, as you can see here, is it's gradually sloped along the riverbank. It can be flooded, and when it's flooded, it's used a little differently than when it is. And it improves the ecological quality of the river as well, creating an environmental conducive to bringing fish back. One of the important things I think, again, in cities is not randomly trying stuff here and there, but taking areas of the city and trying to integrate multiple aspects, district scale thinking beyond the building. That's important. And we see this in several aspects of planning in Rotterdam, and one is on green roofs. Many cities are putting green roofs up, but in a lot of ways, if you want them to address urban heat islands, there has to be a certain critical mass of them that's just not one here, one there. And the city of Rotterdam has taken a very comprehensive approach here. They've identified 4 types of roofs and how to employ those in different areas of the city. And then they're being installed on municipal property and elsewhere. So what you see here are the different types that have been developed. So here's large-scale green roofs that are being used in the harbor. Then we have ones for older neighborhoods employing a very different kind of green roof. One for areas of more high rises, and I guess I only had 3 of them up there. But the idea is that these are then designed for particular areas and then built to scale in particular areas as well. Another innovation is the water square. So this one is the Benthemplein Water Square. It's the first one developed. Well, it's actually the second one in Rotterdam, but the first one of significance. And this was built in a particular neighborhood that I'll talk about in a minute, but the idea again here is to create public spaces that are floodable, and then the water can be released gradually. So the idea of creating these spaces was introduced in 2005 by a landscaped architect, Florian Boer. You probably know him from a firm called Urbanism. And he designed and conceived of this. The city was really intrigued, the engineering department, with the idea. They were eager to explore how to make it work. It opened in November of 2012. It has 3 separate water catchment areas, 2 underground infiltration devices that it works with, and it can hold about 2 million liters of water. So when I was there last September, I was eager to see it in action and was a bit disappointed with what I saw. And so here it was in reality. It's looking a little unmaintained, leaves all over, kind of grimy stuff on surfaces where people were supposed to sit. And I asked Florian, who seemed somewhat embarrassed, about, well, how is this supposed to work under these kind of conditions? And he said, well, we have this problem, and that there's two different departments of the city that were responsible for different aspects of cleaning. They had never talked to each other, and neither one had really ever gotten out there to do any cleaning of it. So as you see, maintenance makes or breaks an approach, and it kind of illustrates the concept I was talking about with the absolute importance of working across departments. So, you know, this grand thing that everyone sees in actuality isn't so grand. But I guess that's a small thing. There's other aspects of this are really good as well in terms of entrepreneurialism. So there was a lot of experimentation that went with this particular approach. How can we create more resilient spaces, particularly in neighborhoods that are mostly paved? And so this was one person who was encouraged to try her water tiles here in this area, and how they work is they can be under the surface or around the surface. They hold water and again retain that water. And so this has been perfected and is now a marketable product rather. So there's different types of water squares that are needed in different environments, and the engineering behind them has been produced by the Urbanism in this comic book that shows, and the Wondrous Water Square shows how the concept was developed. So from this water square, what has happened next was taking this to a whole district scale. So this sits in a neighborhood called Soho, and it's an area in need of redevelopment. As I walk through the neighborhood, I see signs of neglect, even though there's 2 technical colleges in the area, a youthful population. But one of the interesting things is there's this elevated rail line, and as a creative thing, I don't know if you can see it here, the channels in here have been turned into businesses. So in an area that was just dead with no activity, now there's restaurants in this area, and it's beginning to thrive. So it's part of a broader community, participatory community development project that has at its core stormwater management. So again, this is something I look for, connecting, not just doing one thing, stormwater management, but connecting it to other parts or other needs of the city. So in this area, about 94% of the land was paved, and what they're looking to do is take that paved area, depave it, and turn it into other uses. And so there were a lot of parking lots that are being transformed into little park spaces, plantings, and it's all being done in collaboration with people in the neighborhood. One other thing that they're doing is, this is just some of the various projects going on, is polder roofs, and they're being tested throughout this area to see how they worked. They expand on the idea of green roof, a polder roof, by combining water storage with urban agriculture and social space. So people actually go up in that space, it's park-like, there's seating and so forth on top of the building. And finally, Rotterdam is working with the city port as a test bed as well for different types of technologies. So the Netherlands has created a world-class economic sector in various aspects of water management, and I argue that there's a strong connection between city planning, how they experiment and try these projects, and the ability of the Netherlands to be able to take these technologies and approaches and use them in the United States, in China, in all over the world. And I think it's starting to have some influence in the United States. So in my book, one of the cities that I talk about is Milwaukee, where, yes, it's sitting on a lake, but not a city you think of as a water city. But they got the idea, we are in a lake, we have a lot of assets, we're going to create this water council around various water technologies and create a new economic development sector. So it's very Dutch thinking. And when they first had a consultant come in to look at the economic development potential, the response was, water isn't a sector. Manufacturing is a sector. Technology is a sector. But they persisted. And now they are working with Dutch firms, and they're also developing eco-industrial districts on brownfield space that incorporate many aspects of stormwater management that we see developed in the Netherlands. So I have other examples as well, but I'll just conclude with that one to say that this approach is alive and well in the United States, thanks to the Dutch.
Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to summarize a couple things that I think of as highlights from the talks we've heard and some things that are particularly relevant to this, and then we'll get on to our final speaker and still leave a chance for some open exchange and dialogue. One theme I think that has come across loud and clear was this idea of multifunctionality. If you're going to make an investment, public or private, it's really helpful if it can be for a structure or a system that can be useful in more than one way and under more than one set of conditions. So we see a secondary bypass channel also being the center of urban redevelopment and focusing on all of the community benefits as well as ecological benefits. You see the parking garage doubling as a cistern during high flow, and the same with the water squares. So this idea is obviously a terrific one to take away from tonight, but I'm also going to kind of tell you the flip side of the coin, the darker side of some of these things when you try to translate them into the US. For example, you have some very different impacts from professional liability. So if you're going to design a water square and you're also going to acknowledge that sometimes it will be flooded, but it would look like a really cool place for young people, maybe very small children, to play, when are they going to sue you? And how quickly is it going to put you out of business? So those questions actually can stop something like that very much in its tracks, something I hope we can discuss a little later. But I think it's imperative for us to start changing that, and I think the best tool to overcome, to anticipate and guard against that type of thinking, that kind of restriction in options, has to do with that early engagement of the community. So another theme that has already been spoken of extensively is the idea of the public involvement in planning, and also, I would say, the level of extreme knowledge that has been imparted across generations, across departments, between professionals and lay people, within civic governance, within business and industry. You don't get people saying, nah, let me develop there. I'll make so many jobs for community. That hypothetical flood problem is, that's, who cares? Or it's intangible. And yet we see decisions like that made. In fact, in the not very distant past, we see there are many communities around Massachusetts who've hired consultants to fight with FEMA and say, hey, make our flood map show that that's not a flood zone here because we had some other plans and this is putting a wrench in the works. Well, I can tell you that's not a very wise, anticipatory stance to take. But it's alive and well in our country in this time. Another really important theme is the one tied to dynamics of systems. We have if your world revolves around the survey document that someone captured at a point in time and the design that you have put onto that sheet, which is increasingly digital but still generally static in nature, we see the design world so often as something that is on a two-dimensional sheet and at a fixed point in time, instead of understanding the relationships, relationships between sediment flow, water flow, low water conditions, floodwater conditions, how many channels you have turns out to have a great deal of influence on what the water height will be in those channels, what the shorelines and embayments are configured as, has an awful lot of influence on how large a storm surge and how high and how risky those most extreme events, flood events, can be. And yet we don't have a very good decision process for capturing those differences and those interconnections at the level of decision process on a project-by-project, site-by-site basis, nor do we even have a very well-evolved system for doing that on the regional basis. And I'll contrast that with the Dutch system, where there are many layers of government, and they are very highly respected, and not just seen as some all-powerful, yet often inconvenient decision guru that, decision czar that overrules others. People are just like, I'm glad someone's looking at this because that's important. And we learned that the hard way several times. So actually, I come from a long line of Dutch engineers. My grandfather was born in Rotterdam, and his father came to this country in the 1920s as part of some major bridge and tunnel projects all around the eastern U.S. And I grew up, in a sense, drinking the Kool-Aid of how awesome these Dutch engineering feats were. But by training as a geologist and ecologist, I became really fascinated by those ways that the natural system cares for itself and helps organize things back to an equilibrium condition. Or again, it's not a perfect panacea, but there's this capacity that many healthy ecological and geomorphic systems have to recover after impact and to find the right way to balance these forceful events such as floods and high wave intensity storms and so on. And it's very fascinating how these two fields have really begun to merge. And I could go on and on about some of the ways that was brought to bear in the aftermath of Katrina as part of the hard infrastructure, green infrastructure system, the $14 billion system of the hurricane storm damage risk reduction system around Greater New Orleans. But that's a fantastic example that I would say already exists in this country and was the result of a joint venture between my former firm and a major Dutch firm, Arcadis, depending on which country you're in. And it also represents something that I think even helped feed back into the Dutch dialogue, this idea of how you deal with land subsidence and future sea level projections and a different way of mapping out risk and vulnerability and potential mitigation strategies over time, which, as many strengths as the Dutch system had previously, their situation wasn't identical to that in New Orleans, and they weren't as vulnerable to some of the sea level rise issues. However, I think it can be said that that had not systematically entered the thought process and the decision frameworks there. And so the post-Katrina situation, for a lot of reasons, really revolved around that topic and helped bring that thinking moving the other way to help further advance the Dutch system. So I think there's great opportunity for more and more cross-pollination. And with that, I'll turn it over for our final presenter.
Thank you. I should first apologize for having zero Dutch blood. But I do represent a Dutch firm today. I run the New York office for One Architecture, a Dutch urban planning, design, and architecture firm. Now, when you all go home tonight, what I'd like you to do is to go to your architectural bookshelf, and in between small, medium, large, X-large, and 10 by 10, pull out your copy of Super Dutch, turn to the very back, and you'll see a little blurb in there that references One Architecture as a quirky upstart. But it's true, ever since Matthias Bo started the firm, we've been thinking differently about things. Whether it's doing odd things like slicing up old buildings that nobody else had thought worth to keep. This is the former St. Joseph Monastery in Deventer, where one upended normal development practice by creating a master plan for redevelopment and getting it pre-approved by the local municipality and planning department before the original landowners sold the development rights to developers, which allowed them to capture the value of their property in a way that the profits are normally only captured by the developer. So this story of redesigning processes before designing architecture, it was artfully rendered by Matthew Stadler in the book on the screen here, Deventer, and if you'd like to hear more about the story, please support Mr. Stadler. But the upside-down approach to urbanism has been evident from the earliest projects. In fact, the very first project that One Architecture had built was a daycare center in which they decided that the children should be considered the client. And so the children were interviewed about the programs and the materials and the way that they would like the space to be. And ultimately, they were the arbiters of design. And this was one of the early projects of the firm that really put it on the map for, as we say, thinking differently about process. Other examples, zooming out a bit, the mix and match, plug and play, community-driven design of the Houda redevelopment, where One has been the chief planner for nearly a decade. Elsewhere, leveraging infrastructure projects to restitch neighborhoods back together, here in Amsterdam, and here a proposal for Leiden. Zooming out to the regional level and using scenario-based planning to plot different futures for the Western Netherlands megalopolis, linking Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and a dozen smaller municipalities. This was the 2040 plan for the Randstad. Or looking at new ideas from other disciplines, like circular economies or smart cities, to create new development models for affordable housing on brownfield sites like Buick-Slaughterham in the north part of Amsterdam, which was kind of like a Dutch version of homesteading. Essentially, instead of giving out subsidized housing or subsidized apartments in large mega blocks developed by developers, a consortium of designers and planners in Amsterdam banded together and created a framework by which this brownfield area north of the city would be chopped up, and then small groups of individuals could form cooperatives and essentially build their own row houses. And one of the things we learned through this project was ongoing, currently working its way through construction, is that left to their own devices, the houses that were built by the entrepreneurial Dutch were actually much more sustainable and eco-friendly than the stuff that the developers were built. And it was because that since they were going to own that house and live in it, they didn't want to pay the high electric bills. So it changed the way that these buildings were built. Then 3 years ago, like Jaap, One Architecture was brought to New York in the aftermath of Sandy and the Rebuild by Design competition. The team worked on Lower Manhattan, and these two slides represent what have become follow-on real projects funded by federal money and city money for the East Side Coastal Resiliency, which basically protects the Lower East Side. And then what we're currentally working on now, the feasibility study for the rest of Lower Manhattan and the financial district. And if one of my colleagues from BIG was presenting, they would stop here and say, this is the most important slide in the whole presentation, and it's because of all these logos here at the bottom. these types of projects take an amazing amount of collaboration, an amazing amount of different specialties, very multidisciplinary, and much of what we do now as one is trying to synthesize between all of these different specialties and these different languages that are spoken by the climate scientists, the landscape architects, the engineers, the starchitects, and trying to bring all of these together. Most of this intro you should be familiar with, as Boston was also affected to some extent by the rains from Sandy. But as with what Jaap presented, the process starts by looking at where the water's coming from and what's flooding. So a picture of Lower Manhattan after the 14th Street Con Ed station blew up. And requisite images of the devastation caused by Sandy. I think it was mentioned earlier several times about the way that disaster focuses energies towards problems that have been put off. One of the interesting things, this is Matthias's sketch at the beginning of the project. One of the interesting things is, as is the case in New Orleans and many other cities that have experienced catastrophic flooding, you can go back and you can look at the historic maps of the high ground that people used to live on and what was water, and there's normally a pretty close correlation. So much of what is now the floodplain has been infilled since the Dutch left at the end of the 17th century. So one of the key drivers in this project is essentially not wanting to do a pure engineering solution. Just didn't think that was feasible for a city like New York City, an area like Lower Manhattan. We look at the way that old infrastructure has been reappropriated for the public benefit. I say, well, if we think about it ahead of time, is there a way that we can combine the social program with the infrastructure and essentially create social infrastructure? The idea being that if we're designing for a 1% of the time event, what about the other 99% of the time? We're going to spend $1 billion on 1% of the time and forget about 99% of the time. I just don't think that's a good approach. The one part that I did want to focus on in this presentation, and spare you most of it since you saw the design, was this idea of process and the complexity of, as you touched on, dealing with governance in the United States, the complexity of the way that even a relatively small land area is chopped up 1,000 different ways in various political districts, various representatives, various organizations, multiple levels of politics and governance, hundreds of community organizations, different types of land ownership. These were the stakeholders that were identified during the Rebuild by Design process. And part of designing the big U, or perhaps the biggest part of it, was actually designing the engagement and the process by which the iterative process of working with all of these stakeholders and building inertia, building momentum for design. And it takes a lot of legwork. It takes a lot of listening. It takes coming to the table without having a predisposed idea of what the final design is going to look like. In a sense, it's as Matthias likes to say, a love child of Robert Moses' level ambition, but with the fine-grained neighborhood attention of a Jane Jacobs. So we tried to apply this idea and combining it with the engineering reality of the different pinch points, and we came upon this idea together of compartmentalizing. Basically, it's not a big U per se, it's a bunch of smaller U's. And once you break these up into smaller pieces, you can circumvent the problems that of governance and balkanization that's been discussed before. And essentially what we propose with the Big U and its follow-on projects is this kind of block by block, foot by foot, fine-tailored solution rather than a one-size-fits-all singular design. And this translates even down to the sections. As I was mentioning before, talking about, well, what can this alignment be? It doesn't just have to be flood protection. It can serve multiple purposes. It can be integrated with the landscape. It doesn't have to be some kind of oppressive thing. The first stage of the project, which I've been working on personally for the last 2 years, is the East Side Coastal Resiliency, which was a focus area in the Rebuild by Design competition and what brought the first $335 million of federal money to New York City, which was later followed by another $100 million. This is a very vulnerable neighborhood, has the deepest floodplain in Manhattan and the largest reservoir of public housing. More than 60% of Manhattan's public housing is in this area and vulnerable. And so the other piece of this, in addition to all those political and governmental and agency stakeholders, you have the Lower East Side, which is one of the most organized communities in the country, and we worked with dozens of these community groups, bringing them along through the design process from the very beginning. Explaining the toolkits, explaining basically the constraints and the trade-offs of each of these different types of options and what they could be, and bringing in these focus groups, in these community sessions, these different models, these different examples of the way that, the myriad ways that you could implement flood protection, and essentially giving them the opportunity from the get-go to not only understand the constraints and the trade-offs, but to design their own waterfront, given the toolkit, to give input back to us on the way that we should be designing. And then we would take that input back to the drawing board in this iterative process, synthesize all of this input, and then bring it back to the community, say, well, this is what we heard, and this is what we did with it. What do you think? Let's talk in more detail. And it becomes this cycle going back and forth. I'll just flip through a couple of the images. In all of these cases, again, this idea of something that takes the opportunity of the flood protection money, the infrastructure investment, to create a 99% of the time program that also protects the city in that 1% of time. That's all I have today.
How many of you see an easy way? Yeah, see an easy way to translate some of the ideas you've seen here? How many sense certain points of friction that may be different? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I was just going to say, generally, I'd be interested to hear thoughts on how these techniques could be applied to Boston.
I'll kick it off by saying that there's more work that's similar to this in the Boston area than you might imagine, but the part where it's scaled up to have this system-wide recognition or the degree of galvanized public attention, that part hasn't happened. But maybe in fact that's another subject for another panel at some point, would be like, you know, stealth living with water. What's already here and how might it all kind of be possible to expand upon as opposed to reinventing the wheel. Yeah.
I wouldn't mind taking a stab with first the caveat that I've been in Boston for about 8 hours now, but it's been an eventful 8 hours. I've been meeting with a lot of designers, engineers here, and as well as some community groups, including community group that was mobilized against both the airport project and or continually against the airport, I guess, and against the Olympics. And we talked about community engagement, and one of the things that they told me was that if there was a process like I just described, where the community was brought in at the very beginning and had an opportunity to feel like they had ownership and a voice, rather than the planning community or the government just coming in from a vacuum and throwing a design at them, that there might have been a different result with the Olympics or with the various plans for transit improvement.
But I think there's a bigger issue in Boston, and one of the things that just makes me want to weep is the Seaport District. In that, when I look at these huge eco districts being developed, those of you who have been my students know in Hammarby Sjöstad in Stockholm, the Royal Seaport in Stockholm, there's a vision from the beginning. How can we take this brownfield area and do everything, integrate everything we know how to do? And, part of it is that developers rule so much. And so by the time the mayor was able to get a developer willing to do something with the parking lots there, it happened too quickly. So there wasn't a thought of how can we raise this so that it wouldn't be vulnerable. And, to this day, the buildings that are going up, yes, there's Article 80, they go through a checklist, but there's no integrated strategy in the most vulnerable land that is developing I don't know if you went down there in your 8 hours, very, very, very quickly. And there's where I think the level of planning and respect for planning is missing a bit, not just in Boston, but many cities.
I would add a little layer to that and say that this raises in my mind the question of, what's the standard of care that the design professionals or the folks who finance these projects and even those who review and approve it, what is it that would be the appropriate set of expectations, and where are we lacking, and where can some of that take place at the level of governance as opposed to, and I would add also the level of disclosure and community engagement in a meaningful way. These things all have to tie in together, and right now people assume this property rights sunny day opportunism prevails it's so deeply entrenched in everything we do. And I think the design profession has a chance to advocate and call out some of these gaps and shortcuts that are often the cause of the issues.
I know that the Water Square was funded 80% by the utility companies there in Rotterdam. And so I wonder, how can we put the design back into engineering, people-centric design, instead of, spending $3 million on something that's going underground? How can we spend that to benefit everyone, for 99% of the time? And it seems like from everyone from the Army Corps of Engineers to the regular engineers of the city, it's that more plural use is forgotten. So how can we start to integrate the continuum? I'm not sure how that starts. But hopefully, more inspiring projects like this will happen and will inspire people throughout, eventually make its way to Boston.
Any other panelists want to take a shot at that?
I think, in that sense, my presentation was provocative because the challenge is how to, in an environment where in Holland we're everybody's used to work together. Everybody knows that it's a problem to live below sea level, as clearly outlined. And I think the way I see it, this is not easy to sort of change the way things are done here, right? But it can start in two ways. One is inspiring projects, make pilot projects that are very visible. People start educating people, and at the same time, on the leadership side, start thinking about this in a holistic way. The problem is everywhere, and there are similarities. Every place is different, but there are typical conditions that, if you look at it from a regional perspective, you can learn joint lessons. One of the problems with this fragmented government, for example, is that everybody's trying to solve its own problem, whereas many of these problems are similar. So why not pool your resources and try to think about this together? And then these two combined, strong leadership needs strong support. So this is a long-term effort. We won't be able to change the way things are done overnight, but building support for a more holistic approach is, I would say, an ambition, but then it's not easy.
So once again, this process needs to be thought of up front, really developed, the community and all the stakeholders, whoever they may be, across all the silos and at all the levels. That's all really essential. There was a question back there.
Can I take a stab at that first? So partly the reason I want to is because I think there's two ways to answer this question. One is more controversial than the other. The first is you can get lucky and have a singular politician with some level of power and vision. For his myriad faults, Bloomberg did a number of amazing things for New York City because he put his effort and resources behind it. That isn't always an option that we have, to rely on some vision politician. And so I think the second answer is more of a question, and it's what do we see our role as architects in this process? And the reason I say this is controversial is because the AIA conference in Saratoga last year started a big argument by answering a similar question this way. I think there was a time, and this goes back to your comment earlier about liability. There's this legendary history of the architect as the master builder and having kind of the knowledge of all of the trades. And over time, we've whittled down through liability to a very regimented idea of what an architect does and what he can put his stamp on. And it's really about legality and liability. And I would propose that there's an opportunity in this kind of crazy shifting world that we have right now for the architects to become, if not a master builder, a master synthesizer, sitting between all of these different disciplines, being the Renaissance men and women. And I think if we as a design profession are willing to step beyond perhaps antiquated ideas on the limits of the profession, then maybe we can be that change.
Maybe picking up on the last couple of comments, I'm particularly interested in how you manage the winners and losers in a project like that up there. We really admire the Dutch experience, sometimes called the Pullman model, where you can reach consensus out of necessity. In contrast, ours may be more commonly a gridlock model, where you can't reach consensus on almost anything. How do you deal with the winners and losers in a design like that, when obviously there are losses of roads and parking and subways and bus lines and housing and property tax and retail space. How do you put that on the table and balance that all out to get to something maybe more equivalent to what the Dutch have been able to accomplish?
It's lots and lots and lots of meetings, to be quite honest. And the thing is that there is no perfect solution, and I think there's a responsibility to the public to be upfront about the trade-offs of the different options, and whether that's using community organization or the public at large or their elected officials or their representatives in the city government to help make those choices. I think it's really about making sure that everybody understands the pros and cons of different options. And maybe that's also part and parcel with not starting with a preconceived design. Maybe makes that easier to happen.
I would say there's a large body of process best practices tied to this from statecraft. You know, there are a lot of folks who've been looking at this in the diplomacy and dispute resolution sector over decades. But when you're looking at the magnitude and the potentially, you know, not just the scale of the money, but the scale of the new shape of a community, physically and economically, socially, and if you're looking at the environmental impacts and how to best manage and balance all of those trade-offs, you really have to up your game in terms of the tools you use and the resources you avail everyone of. And again, it comes down to governance, process, stakeholder inclusion. And there's no one, there's no one checklist that'll get you there. Yeah, but
well, you know, taking that out of the sphere of resilience, in urban planning, there's a lot of areas of carrots and sticks that have been very effective. And one that comes to mind that Bloomberg tried to do was congestion pricing, which he was not able to politically. But looking at Stockholm, I think something like 70% of the people were against this congestion pricing where people would have to pay to drive into certain parts of the city. And so they only did it as a pilot. And part of it was the funds would be used to improve public transit, to improve bike lanes. And people could see a visible difference in the air, and they also appreciated the thing. So after 6 months, they were ready to go full time. And so I think this, I could give numerous examples of, you know, really the carrots and sticks approach being very, very effective.
it sounds like tactical urbanism to me. You know, give people a taste of something and some of the issues melt away and people are ready to embrace it, often when it's least expected.
Yeah, maybe I can make one addition. The Polder model is about collaborating, let's say, talking it out, finding together the solution. And in that sense, is also a large part of it is design, also designing a process and designing a sort of an outcome that has a win-win for everybody, right? If often you can create cumulative effects that benefit everyone, and then there is some compensation as well. Part of it, and maybe related to that, I think the Dutch are very famous for their sort of water infrastructure and levees and structures, etc. And we have a lot of expertise in it, but really the sort of in my mind this addition we can add to, for example, how things are done in the States, try to explore the ways how we can set up such collaborative processes, finding win-win situations, and taking basically organizing the process as have been said several times now.
Sure.
So sort of building on that idea of the collaborative process and the win-win, and that often seems to be involving government and community. But we also have the recognition that in the U.S., most of what gets built happens by disparate private actors. Can you share some experiences where, through any of your work, you've been able to successfully engage some private actors and the motivations, whether it's beyond enlightened self-interest, to begin to contribute positively to what would otherwise be a sort of broader process?
Yeah. Quickly thinking, a lot of these big projects in the Netherlands are design and build and construct. So that's one aspect where a contractor is really, and Travis also hinted on it, sort of invited to think long term, think about 25 years, long term project, which makes sustainable solutions feasible, also economically. And then often there is a sort of a trade-off where, for example, there's the idea in Netherlands of having this ecological network, right? Completing the missing links in for example, a river system or whatever. And then maybe there's a dock in the way which would be privately owned, or there's a developer who wants to develop something here, and the municipality wants some additional housing, and the national government wants this sort of network. And then in a joint project, the developer partly pays for that nature development as well. And in that sense, setting up the project in such a way that also revenue from economic development feeds back into, let's say, the public good. Is that an answer to? And yeah, there are examples.
So. I'm not going to claim a success story, but the beginnings of a story. And want to first caveat by acknowledging that there are people in the audience that have studied the securitization and incentivization of resiliency work. It's not my specialty, but as we're moving into Lower Manhattan, where you have a lot of large landowners, very expensive real estate. What's interesting is because that Sandy happened, you have a lot of these buildings that have basically been forced by their insurance companies to start creating plans, if not already implementing levels of protection and resiliency. And the beginnings of a story I would like to tell is that there are several development sites that are in planning right now in this area. And going back to identifying like knots in the process, under the current building code, they're basically being forced to individually flood-proof 12 buildings across 3 development sites. And this is something that is going to cost a whole lot of money. And we were having a meeting just a few days ago and talking about the fact that if the mechanisms of the legal system and of the building code allowed it, there might be a way for them to essentially shall we say, the equivalent of a bid, a business improvement district, but say like a resiliency improvement district. If we could create a mechanism like that where they could fund or partially fund larger scale flood protection for the whole area, it would actually be cheaper for them. But the thing is that we have these balkanized agencies that have different rules, and we can give them the benefit of the doubt that the Department of Buildings is having this requirement because they think it's a good thing to make sure that everybody is protecting their buildings up to 13 feet. But it's standing in the way of perhaps a better holistic solution. And my hope is that because this has been identified right now, before shovels have hit the ground, that maybe there can be some coordination between the city planning, between the building department, between these developers, and maybe in 2 years I can come back and tell you it's a success story. But
You know, of that story, I'm reminded Ed Masri of Architecture 2030 has started these 2030 districts. There's about 12 of them now in cities through the United States. And they're usually the whole downtown area, and they get the property owners on board in that area one by one to agree to commit to standards on energy consumption, water consumption, and even transportation. But the one in Seattle, they have started to think of joint stormwater solutions from the level of the building owners, property managers, realizing just that they're better off rather than trying to figure it out on their individual property to do it collectively. So I see a lot of hope in these kind of districts.
there's potential because there is the financial argument for it. It just need to figure out the process.
So, Paul, do we have time for one more question before we make some? Who's bold and curious? All right, you've been trying to get your hand up.
I just wondered what the unit of action is. There's the catalytic events such as Sandy, and I think Boston region took heart to that, which I think is smart. But of course, Boston is not just Boston. There's Chelsea, which may be one of the big losers in terms of funding. They're very strapped in terms of funding. So I wondered what the unit of action, whether it's governance or funding, might be. I was also at a charrette in Norfolk, Virginia, and one of the largest tenants, employers, is the Department of Defense. And that potentially opens up the doors to additional leverage and funding. We're starting to see an illusion of national security with climate readiness. And hopefully this isn't pie in the sky if you're hearing someone like Department of Defense. So I wonder what the leveraging unit is or needs to be.
Oh, you know what? I can't resist responding to this one. So after Katrina hit, the Corps of Engineers not only went back to the drawing board, it has had sea level rise guidance that should influence not only, it was a required piece of guidance for every Corps of Engineers project, and it was in that balkanized way there for everyone else to use if first of all they were aware of it and second of all they figured out what to do with it and chose to. That went for other federal agencies as well as other folks like private citizens, towns, you name it. So they had something since 1992, but it had not been a big driver. And in fact, it was not enough, as we all learned the hard way, to prevent the disastrous impacts of Katrina. So a whole new multifaceted anticipatory design protocol was mapped out after Katrina. And then that was canonized in a very clear stepwise fashion with climate adaptation, resilience at multiple levels, and a design life of however long that infrastructure was expected, and as long as the cost benefit and financial business case was, you know, if you're going to say this is going to be, we're spending this money because it's going to do this for this long, but you haven't correctly accounted for the conditions that are that you can anticipate over that functional life, you know, you've missed a really important piece of your due diligence process, which in fact was normal to have happen. So in this case, they made that protocol very real, and they'd really gotten that pushed out to a lot of agencies. And the whole Department of Defense had a big wake-up call where they really changed all of their real estate and facility investment decisions. When Sandy hit, it actually provided the opportunity for the Corps of Engineers to study everything from Maine to Norfolk, everything that they could remotely say had to do with the Sandy impact area. And they said, we're going to actually complete this multi-million-dollar assessment to look at all of the Corps of Engineer projects in that area and look at, you know, well, what were the assumptions when they were built? And do they still hold water, literally and figuratively, today? You know, where are there coastal change, erosion, and land migration processes? Where are there new flood risks? what is vulnerable should some of these Corps of Engineers projects not function the way they were originally designed. So anyway, that whole study, the Sandy Comprehensive Study, actually provided, I would say of all the things that have happened in the last 25 years, that study actually systematically combed through the available history and has put together a set of very specific actionable things. There are a couple of projects in the Boston area where deficits were identified and solutions were identified, and that's particularly true in the areas that were, because of the tide and timing, more impacted by Sandy. But I guess that's the silver lining of waiting until a disaster, waiting until your boat is sunk. You can still be a hero if the areas that take note of that and do systematically identify something to do differently and better. That's there. So I guess everybody should be looking for that information and helping to make all of those identified opportunities everything they can be.
I think this is an area where scenario-based planning can be very valuable, and what I mean there is it's about what your starting point is. So for the first section of the Big U, the one not pictured up here, the East River section by the public housing, there were a lot of constraints. There was federal funding that had a lot of strings attached to it, which dealt with certification from Army Corps of Engineers, which dealt with a schedule, which gave a certain anchor number on what it should cost. And so that first section was very much responding to constraints. On the silver lining idea, the portion that's on the screen right now has no identified funding. And so so we have to take a step back and think about scenarios that might unlock certain sources of funding. If we thought about this section in terms of constraints, we would say, okay, it's going to be a permitting nightmare if we do something out in the water. And we don't have a lot of room to do anything on land because there's the FDR raised freeway. But if we think about from a scenario based approach, scenario one, how can we create new development land and value that could then fund flood protection? Oh, well, you go out on the water, you make another battery park city. And then that can tag on to that, you can have your flood protection. Or if we don't take the FDR for granted and we say 20, 30, 50 years from now, we're not going to have this crumbling piece of infrastructure on our waterfront. So can we start to think now, for something that's already going to be a 10 or 20 year project, can we start to think now about it as a transit project? If you do a big dig, or if you rethink the way that traffic circulation works around Lower Manhattan, can that lead you to not only open up federal highway funding, but also leads you to different design solutions where you can, again, incorporate that resiliency and flood protection as an integrated solution in another scenario.
Any other closing remarks from the panelists?
I had one. It's one short thought. It's really about economics, right? There's huge investments to be made. So how to tie in these type solutions with investment cycles, thinking about long-term, for example, street programs, how can you on the long-term, piece by piece, replace infrastructure as you are already working on it. Yeah, that would be the main closing remark.
I guess mine would be related somewhat to your question when you talk about Norfolk, and we're going to find the money for Norfolk because the world's largest Navy base is there. We'll find the money for New York because it's New York. But what we don't talk about is there are some places that probably retreat is going to have to be the answer because there just aren't the resources to save every single city on the coastline.
And with that, I hope all of you will join me in applauding our fine panelists today. Thanks very much.